So you want to learn how to think like a historian. All right, you probably don't think that, but I promise you, you should. Now, my typical routine is every Friday I post a video in my So You Want to Know More About X topic, and I recommend a number of books and articles on topics. But I realize I should take a step back, especially at this early part of this channel, and talk about what makes up good historical scholarship. What is behind the historian's craft? As a professor of history, I often teach a course titled The Historian's Craft, where we learn how to dissect books, investigate primary sources, and make arguments. So, in my attempt on this channel to try to bridge the worlds of academic and general conversations, this new series, So You Want to Think Like a Historian, or as old fashioned historians will say, like an historian, I'm going to focus on a week by week basis on a different theme or tool or topic of historical scholarship. Because if you haven't noticed, history is a contested space. There are people that will vehemently denounce one another over particular topics. And I think those conversations are always going to continue. History is always a conversation. If you put four historians in a room, ask them a question, you will get five answers. But those conversations always work a lot better when there is at least a common understanding of how the historical practice is done. So this series will focus on the foreign world of historical scholarship to hopefully prompt a conversation of how we can better produce and consume historical topics. Now, I'm sure I'm going to get stuff wrong. I hope those of you who recognize things that I miss will leave comments that say as much and give your own recommendations. And I'm sure a lot of this will be old hat to some viewers, but it might be new to others. And it's impossible to have a general baseline. So please, please engage by sharing the video, liking it, subscribing to the channel so you don't miss future installments, but especially leaving your own comments and suggestions. Today's video is going to be discussing how we read and consume and dissect secondary sources, or what I call, or what scholars call, monographs, which is solo authored books on a particular topic. Now, there are three types of sources that historians typically use. Primary sources, the sources that come from the era that you are studying, and I'll do a whole video on dissecting primary sources because that's the baseline. That's the foundation for any good scholarship. Then there are secondary sources, which is scholars talking about what they learn from those primary sources. That's the type of book we're going to be discussing today. And then there are also tertiary sources, which are books based on secondary books. So a textbook that you likely read in your undergraduate courses is what's known as a tertiary textbook. And maybe I'll talk about in the future as well. All of these different types of genres of books serve different functions. So I'll take them in turn. So today, let's talk about the secondary source, the classic secondary source, which is a solo authored monograph. It may seem ironic for me to say this in a YouTube video, but online sources should not be the endpoint of your interest or your research. That does not mean that online sources like YouTube videos are bad. Quite the contrary. There's a reason I've created a YouTube channel, because I believe it's important to reach out to an audience that now predominantly gets news and information from platforms like YouTube. So subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. But like things, when I talk to my students, they always ask, is Wikipedia a good source? And I think it's similar to online things like YouTube. It's a horrible source if that is the last point you go to and you believe you've conquered a topic just by reading a Wikipedia page or watching a YouTube video. Instead, Wikipedia pages, YouTube videos, online blogs, they should be launching pads. They should be a starting point that whet your appetite. The democratization of knowledge through digital sources has lots of wonderful potential in spreading this information in a much more equitable way than ever before. But there are also pitfalls, and we need to understand those safeguards in order to recognize the limits of these types of platforms. Put simply, there is no quality control for a lot of online sources, whether it be YouTube pages, X accounts, vlogging, TikTok characters. There is no review process to assure that what you are learning from them is accurate and relevant. Popularity does not equate to quality. Algorithms are driven by passion, not by facts. But what these platforms do is they serve as a springboard for further research and a chance for you to know where to dig further. That's why on this channel every Friday, I typically do my So You Want to Know More About X series, and I recommend books and articles for you to go do your own research, because books have a lasting impact. Typically, a lot more work goes into them, and they represent a more substantive foundation. And they will be around for quite a bit, where we have a more transient nature with these types of online platforms. That's not always the case. There are, I know, a lot of really great YouTube channels that put a lot of work into videos on historical subjects that are teaching a general public far more than academics in ivory towers. But we need to recognize those balances. So I'm going to talk about books and why they are built on a different type of platform and have different safeguards in place. So think about this digestion of knowledge as an iceberg. If you're only focused on what's above the water, what is appearing in public view in these general discussions, you are missing a lot, if not a majority, of the actual historical work is going on. You're only getting part of that story. So now that I talked about why books are still so important, even in the age of YouTube, let's dig into those books. So when you are picking up a history book, how can you know its quality even before reading a word? Well, there's a few signs, and hopefully this can give you some background of how these books are put together so that you can be a more discerning consumer of these historical monographs. First, the author does matter, but it's not a final determinant. You do not need to have a PhD in history to be a wonderful historian. Some of the best historians out there work outside of the academy. My favorite historian, Annette Gordon-Reed, she published her first book, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, when she was not a trained historian. And that book transformed the world of Thomas Jefferson's scholarship. But that does not mean that the author is insignificant. You should at least recognize some degree of expertise of whether they have done research, what type of training they've gone through, and what type of background they have that it should inform but not determine your analysis of the book. The next big thing, and I would say this is a much bigger thing, is the press. Note that there are several different types of publishers that produce books on history. There are university presses, there are trade presses, and there are independent presses. And you can find good books in all of those different presses, but you should recognize they operate differently. Now, the gold standard in academic history is going to be from university presses. These are the presses attached to a university, whether it be Oxford University Press, Harvard University Press, Yale University Press. Every major university has a university press. And when you see that symbol on the spine of a book, so this is a book I'm going to be talking about in a bit, the Problem of Democracy in the Age of Slavery. This is published by LSU Press, Louisiana State University Press, which is one of the most prominent and consistently quality presses on the topic of slavery. When you see this logo on a book that it's from a university press, you know that that book went through what is called a peer review process, meaning an author submitted a proposal and a manuscript to that press. That press then sent that proposal with the manuscript chapters out to at least 2 peer reviewers who are experts in their field, and their job is to dissect, tear apart the manuscript, and determine whether it is worth publishing. Now, that is a peer review process that doesn't always catch all the problems in a book, but it does capture a lot, and at least determines that there is a baseline, that it at least passes the standard of quality necessary for academic scholarship. I'm going to give you an example of how that works later on with my own experience. Then you have trade presses. These trade presses could be big New York presses, like here is a book from Knopf that I just read and reviewed. It's by the scholar Richard Carwadine. It's titled Righteous Strife, How Warring Religious Nationalists Forged Lincoln's Union. This was published by the very famous and prominent press Knopf. Now, to get a book contract with Knopf and most trade presses, proposals don't have to go through a scholarly peer review. They do not send the books out for scholarly quality control. They are making a decision as a press about whether it is going to sell. Now, that does not mean that they don't produce quality scholarly works. In fact, some of the best historical books come from these trade presses, but you should recognize that that does not mean that they went through a review process. And I'll talk about my own experience publishing with both a university press and a trade press. And then the final press are independent presses. Now, there are some small independent presses that operate like trade presses, like say Signature Books in the Mormon studies world, that have a strong degree of quality control. But there's also a lot of independent presses that are just vanity presses that allow you to publish without any safeguards. And those should be red flags. You should recognize that where the manuscript is coming out will determine how many checkpoints that manuscript has passed. And the gold standard, of course, is the university presses, but trade presses can reach that as well. And there is a wide degree of variety and quality when it comes to independent presses. And finally, each of those presses can have a distinct reputation. I had mentioned before that you might not think that LSU Press sounds that prestigious, but as I mentioned, they are one of the best university publishers on slavery. And so recognizing what presses are known for being great at what, like for instance, Signature Books for Mormon books, can really help you recognize when a book is worth engaging and when it's not. A few other points to keep in mind when determining whether a book might be worth engaging. First, you can look at a book's acknowledgments, footnotes, and works cited sections. In the acknowledgments, when the author mentions all the people who helped them put the book together, look and see if they're thanking a lot of archivists and if they've visited a lot of archival repositories and how many scholars they've been able to talk to and get their books reviewed. That's a really good sign of how integrated they are in the scholarly community. You can also look at their footnotes and works cited to see how steep is this book in actual research. And that should give you a clue on whether it's going to be worth actually engaging. A few other tricky ways to tell if a book is worth engaging is blurbs and reviews. The blurbs are what you find on the back of a book, where other scholars universally say that this is the best book I've ever read. Take blurbs with a grain of salt. It's a good starting point. It should capture your attention, but recognize that these are people who are wanting the book to do well. And so they're not, purely unbiased. Now, they're important. I don't want to downplay it. I blurb a lot of books on my own, but those should not be the determining factor, though you should see who is actually vouching for this book. More revealing and important is reviews. The reviews written by scholars that appear in publications and talk about the quality of the book that they read. Those newspapers, magazines, journals, they get a review copy sent to that reviewer. The reviewer reads the whole thing and basically tells you whether you should read the book or not. Recognize that there are different types of these reviews. Reviews that appear in Wall Street Journal or New York Times or the New York Review of Books. Those reviews are going to be directed to a general audience, and they're going to focus on things like the overall point of the book, as well as its readability and how it fits into the contemporary, intellectual scene. I always strongly recommend that those are useful. I've written those on my own. Those are useful, but the gold standard, if you really want to know if a book is its quality, go to academic journal reviews, Journal of American History, American Historical Review, Church History, if you are in Mormon history, which I know a lot of my viewers are in. You go to Journal of Mormon History or Dialogue of Journal of Mormon Thought or Mormon Studies Review, because those are where experts are assessing the quality of research and argument. And that can really help you recognize how that book has been received within the field. By the way, this is especially important for books that are published by trade presses, because remember, I mentioned that one of the differences between a trade press and a university press is a university press, you can feel assured that it's gone through a peer review process. But a trade press, you can't be assured of that. But at least through academic reviews, it's almost like a post hoc review process where scholars are saying after publication, yes, this manuscript is worth engaging. So those are a few things to keep in mind when determining whether a book is worth picking up and whether it's trustworthy. So to provide further insight on how these books are put together, I thought I would speak to my own personal experience. So I took down off my shelf one of my books, American Nationalism's Imagining Union in the Age of Revolutions, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. Let me give you some background on how this book came together so you can know the backdrop of the construction of these books, which should help you better decipher how to dissect them. So I did my PhD thesis. It was called PhD thesis in the UK. It's called PhD dissertation in America on this topic, the construction of nationalist ideas in America in the 50 years following independence. And when I was done with that large dissertation, I had a postdoctoral fellowship and I worked on revising it, and then I sent it to Yale University Press. Yale University Press then sent that manuscript to two blind reviewers. And when I say blind reviewers, I mean that they did not know who authored the manuscript, and I, who authored the manuscript, did not know who the reviewers were. Those two reviewers took 4 months dissecting the entire manuscript, and they sent reader reports back to the press saying, this book has potential, but it requires a lot of work on X, Y, and Z. And so the press sent me this list of things to work to revise. I spent another year revising the manuscript in response to the very thoughtful, precise, and careful review process. And I sent that manuscript back to the press. Then the press sent it to two new readers who, once again, analyzed all of it. And guess what? At the end of that process, the reviewer said, it's still not up to par. And so the press decided not to publish it. That was an example of the safeguards in place with a press. So they sent me the feedback. I was, of course, crestfallen, but I recognized the validity of the types of critiques they were offering. So I went back into the manuscript, revised it once more, and then sent it to Cambridge University Press this time. Cambridge University Press sent it to two more readers who read through every line. They gave me much more positive reviews because I had made the necessary changes. And the end result was a publication of this book, which, again, was not published by the first press I sent it to because it was not good enough. But that process of peer review enabled me to improve the book to the point of publication to where I could be proud of when it eventually appeared with a press like Cambridge University Press. So that's an example of the type of process behind a university press book that you can be assured that those works have passed a degree of qualitative review. Now, does that mean it captures all the problems with the books? Of course not. Like I mentioned, there's lots of disagreements among historians. But these books that pass review at least can claim that they are working with a standard level of historical practice, which enabled them to be published. All right, that went a lot longer than I planned. It turns out when I get going on books, I can talk on and on about the process. I hope it makes sense. And I hope this was useful to at least a few of you to pull back the curtain on how the publishing world operates, which can hopefully allow you to be better readers and consumers of historical books. Let me know what I missed. Let me know what I got wrong. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel so that you can see future videos that will be coming up on Fridays in this So You Want to Think Like a Historian series. And please let me know what else you would like to hear about. I'm going to be doing videos on dissecting primary sources, on how to construct arguments, on making historiographical interventions. All of those topics are crucial because, again, history is more relevant now than ever before, so it's all the more important to understand how history is constructed.